Brexit time. Woohoo! My favourite. So, I'm really pleased to be joined by Annika from XTRAX and Louise from Motionhouse to help me through this delicate subject. So, one of the things we did was we wrote a little letter to the Home Office, and we asked about four main things. I was sort of advised not to write a big essay. It still was big enough. I even put some pictures on to show what outdoor arts were. And I got a kind of quite bland reply from them that sort of didn't really address too much. But one of the key things about what we were asking obviously was about freedom of movement and honouring bookings, and kind of the basic message from all of this is that we can continue to move until the end of 2020, depending on what deal or no deal happens. And I also got another email just yesterday, so I haven't really digested it, that was a little bit more about the cultural world, which was quite interesting. And what they had to say there was that they would be looking at cultural exemptions more fully with the DCMS in whatever scenario we go to. Louise is going to talk. You've just come back from Malta, haven't you, with Motionhouse? So it was potentially at one point kind of one of our first tours for the sector post the 29th of October deadline. Obviously that all changed. And we all went to some of these UK theatre events that they organised, and haulage was a massive thing. I mean, it's talk about not being ready in any scenario. But a lot of adjustments are going to have to be made there. And then the work permit question, if we do end up in a position of having to have work permits for every country. Obviously every country, they've made it so clear to us that every country has a different process and a different timeline. And one of the interesting bits of advice that I picked up from the event I attended was, if you're planning to look at your touring for a particular date, was to concentrate maybe on 3 countries in a particular period. Would it was that easy to plan a tour? I totally know. But it kind of made sense that if it comes to it and we do have to go through work permits for every country, perhaps just 1 year do Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, next year do Spain, Italy and Portugal or something like that. But that was an interesting piece of advice. So these are online, so do have a look, and I'll process the new one that came in and pop that online. So firstly, Annika, I'm going to hand over to you if that's okay. Annika from XTRAX, here we go. Shall I give you that? Thank you so much for doing this. Let me just take that off for you. There we go, thank you.
So I'm Annika from XTRAX. At XTRAX, we work internationally quite a lot, and we work with a lot of artists and festivals. So we've actually had quite a lot of questions coming in. That's why we thought it would be really useful to kind of keep track of all the information that's coming out. It's a lot coming out and it changes all the time. So what I'm presenting at the moment is what we have as such. Obviously, it's all probably going to change in the next couple of weeks or months. So just kind of to bear in mind that we have to kind of keep on track with that. Also in the office, we've got quite an international team, so it's something that's really close to our hearts, and we know that obviously in the sector, it's the people that kind of make the work, make the sector happen. So we know that that's quite a big concern around either working with people from Europe or also here in the UK, or touring and working with internationals maybe in Europe itself. So what I wanted to look at was at the movement of people. So first of all, kind of if we do crash out with a no deal, or if we do have a deal, it's kind of looking at the EU citizens from the EEA or Switzerland, and how that might affect them to work in the UK. So this is obviously important for yourself if you're affected, but also for organisations that might employ or work with freelancers from those countries. So overall, there's 2 main options for people who want to live and work in the UK after Brexit. So it's either applying for British citizenship or to apply to the EU settlement scheme. We're going to look at the EU settlement scheme first. So the deadline to apply for that, if there is a deal, is the 30th of June 2021. And if there's no deal, that will be the 31st of December 2020. It's free to apply, and kind of out of experience that we've had, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to process. And the main thing is that you need to be able to prove that you've had a permanent residence in the UK for the time that you've lived here. And that could be either through a national insurance number or invoices kind of that you've had from that period. If you're not from if you're not a citizen of those countries, there might still be other ways of getting into that settlement scheme. So kind of just do maybe look at the government website to check on that. And I just noted a couple of phone numbers at the bottom here as well, in case anybody wanted a bit more advice on that. So looking at the settled and pre-settled status, I think it's the same process to apply, but the outcome kind of depends a bit on how long you've lived in the UK beforehand, so if you get settled or pre-settled status. If you've lived in the UK for more than 5 years continuously, you will probably get the settled status, which once you've got it means that you can stay as long as you want, and you could even leave the UK for 5 years without losing your status. For the pre-settled status, that's if you haven't lived in the UK continuously for 5 years, so anything less than that, and it allows you to stay for up to another 5 years. You can leave the UK for up to 2 years, but if you do after that want to apply for settled status, you have to make sure you kind of keep a permanent residency in the UK as well. And yeah, you can apply for settled status after you've been in the UK for a total of 5 years. Some questions that might come up around family as well is, so if you've got close family members that want to join you in the UK, they can join you until the 31st of December 2020, and after that, it depends. That's kind of what we read quite a lot, especially on the government website. It will depend if we get a deal, if we not get a deal, what kind of deal we'll get. So most likely, if we do get a deal, is that your family can join you if it's kind of a close relationship. And if there's no deal, the deadline for close family members joining you in the UK is the 29th of March 2022. Then I thought there was one quite interesting point around if you want to, so if you're from the EU and want to apply for settled status in the UK, but you still work in the EU every now and then. So for example, if you come from Spain but want to live in the UK and maybe teach some workshops in Holland at the same time, you can still apply for the settled status, but you have to come back once a week to kind of keep that, which seems a bit like back and forth, but I guess that's kind of something to look into. And then the other part is applying for British citizenship. That's you can do that if you're over 18 and have had settled status or indefinite leave to remain or enter the UK for at least 1 year. That takes a bit longer. It takes about 6 months and costs around about £1,350. And there's quite a lot of other things you have to do, including speaking the language and intent to stay for longer. Again, if you've got any more questions, there's some information points at the bottom of that slide. So that's kind of people wanting to come and live and work in the UK. Then obviously there's us going to work in Europe, and that kind of it ties in with the Schengen area, but I think Louise is going to talk about that a bit more in detail later on. But it's basically also keeping track of how many days you or any of the people you work with have spent in the Schengen area over a certain amount of time. I think it's 90 days over a period of 6 months that you're allowed to be in that Schengen area if we don't have a deal. If we do have a deal, it will all change again. Some other questions that came up were around European funding and UK organisations. So obviously, if we're kind of working closely with European partners, that's one of the main things that really keeps us going, and that's really interesting for the sector. So the Creative Europe funds have stated officially on their website that the UK can participate until we leave the EU, which is great, but doesn't really help that much. So they have said that if there is a no deal, the EU will stop paying UK organisations. However, the UK government has agreed that they will underwrite the payments to UK organisations for any projects that have already been funded or agreed that they would receive funding. It's also likely that if the UK leaves the EU, and especially without a deal, that we would become a third country partner, and that would mean that we would not be able to be the lead partner on any EU projects, but that we could still be included as a third country partner. So again, in future, well, the website, the Creative Europe website states that it will all depend if we will have a deal or not, how that will develop. If there is a deal, it will depend. If not, so at the moment it states that the UK country, organisations can still apply for this funding until the 31st of December 2020. And then I just kind of went through another list of things that we were thinking about if we do work internationally in the EU. Other things to consider, so if you or your organisation import or export any goods with the EU, you will need an EORI number for taxation, which us at XTRAX, the HMRC actually just sent us that, so maybe just check if you've got that already. It's a number that starts with GB at the beginning. Also making sure that you and everybody you travel with have passports that are valid for at least 6 months. If you're planning on driving in the EU, you will need an international permit that costs about £5, and also a green card and a GB sticker for your car. Around insurance, we raised this with Arts Council and DCMS, and they said it's a bit of a grey area at the moment, so just make sure you kind of contact your insurers beforehand, make sure that you're still insured, public liability, that they would cover that in the EU, or if you'd have to maybe take out a different cover. And this similar kind of thing around healthcare, if we do come out of the EU without a deal, there might be scenarios where you or your performers might have to pay healthcare here in the UK, but also in the country that you're performing in. And it's most likely that the EHIC cards that we've got at the moment won't be valid as well. So it's kind of looking into healthcare options for that. All very rosy. Visas and permits for working in the EU, again, check with the country that you'd be travelling to, especially in a no-deal scenario. If not, I think they are negotiating at the moment kind of what the deal could look like over that. And the same around social security. So at the moment, there's no real kind of agreements on that yet. So we just have to continue checking on any agreements that have been made between countries in the EU and Great Britain. One that I thought I didn't even think about, but obviously if you're using your mobile phones, it might be that we will have to pay for roaming again, so just check that with your providers. And this is another one that kind of came up quite often, and something that I think a lot of people might not be thinking about. It's around data and GDPR. So at the moment, the whole of the EU has got an agreement that we can share data freely. If we crash out without a deal, that will no longer be the case. So you will have to check any kind of agreements that you've got with organisations that you work with in Europe that includes the sharing of data. So that could be anything like, for example, if you perform a show and you gather audience emails at that show, officially you would not be allowed to take them over back into the UK unless you've got an agreement with the festival or the venue that you're performing in. So just make sure that you've kind of got that covered. And then, of course, if you've got a website that has .eu in the domain, we will not be allowed to have that anymore if we crash out of the UK. So maybe just double check that and make sure that you can switch that to a different domain name as well. And that's it from me.
Thanks, Annika. Good stuff. Thank you kindly.
So just before I bring Louise, thank you so much, Annika, for doing all that research. Do you have that on your website? Not yet. I mean, we'll share these slides with the conference afterwards, so that will go out that way, but we'll look at how we do that. Another thing we're doing at the Arts Council's behest is we have been keeping some tracks on some data of how bookings are going in Europe at the moment. So people like Abby Collins, Small Scale, Acrojou, Architects of M, Motionhouse, Mimbra, Human Hood have all given me like 3 years worth of data, and we will update that at the end of this year to work out our bookings going down, and also some festivals. We'll keep track of that. So Louise, welcome back from Malta. Love your lanyard. It's a Maltese lanyard. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much, Louise.
I've got a notebook here from a briefing I went to, so forgive me if I, from now and again, just double check that I'm informing you as accurately as I can, because I am absolutely not a Brexit specialist. I do not claim to be an expert, but I found myself in a position where I had to very, 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 very quickly figure out what the hell we were going to do, because, as Angus just said, we had a booking in Malta in November. We did, in fact, fly out there on the 16th of November, spent a week there performing our fantastic show, Wild. But obviously, you know, it's not difficult to work out that had no deal occurred on the 31st of October, we would have found ourselves being guinea pigs, to put it mildly. So fortunately, UK Theatre put in place some incredibly informative briefings, Brexit briefings, as and when January rolls around, if we're in the same position, or God knows how many more times we might find ourselves in the same position. If they offer them again, I'd really strongly advise people to go, because there was a real panel of experts, and the two areas that particularly were pertinent to me and really helped me figure out how I was going to navigate the Motionhouse scenario was a haulage specialist and a lawyer who absolutely understood about moving people around and sort of immigration law. So I want to talk you through the things that is sort of my potted things a touring company will need to be looking out for. So the first thing I'm going to talk a little bit about how touring works. Many of us in this room know that. Of course, at the moment, we lob the stuff in the van, we head off into the EU, we do our tours. Motionhouse does a huge amount of touring, and sadly, with Brexit stuff coming up, we go in and out a lot, endlessly, because it isn't easy to just go to one country and do a neat little geographical tour. So obviously, the two sort of factors of that then are the stuff and the people. They're the kind of crucial elements. So the stuff. If your stuff is anything other than what you might carry in a bag, whether it's on a plane or on a train or just in a domestic car, you suddenly find yourself in the ghastly land of carnets. Now, for those that don't understand what a carnet is, basically a carnet is a passport for your stuff. So at present, if you tour anywhere outside the EU, you may well be familiar with having a carnet. It lists every single item that's going to leave the UK, and basically that's checked off on exit, and then it's checked off again when you re-enter, and it's basically to ensure that you're not eligible for import or export duty. So we've had familiarity with those for our longer haul touring, but the rather terrible prospect is that unless there is a deal, and all I can do is base it on the worst case scenario, no deal, Brexit planning, because that was what I had to do. And I think we can probably all say we're not out of the woods on that one yet, transition period or not. Basically, without a deal, the UK immediately becomes a third country in relation to the EU. What that means is we're treated the same as Australia or the US or New Zealand or a whole range of countries. We lose our capacity to tour as effortlessly as we currently do. The first part of that, therefore, is that you must have a carnet. A carnet, this passport, costs several £100s to produce, and it has to be absolutely accurate because Customs and Excise can look at it with a fine-tooth comb, and if you return with not exactly the same object that you went out with, it can be quite problematic for you. The rather terrifying thing about a carnet is that you have to quantify the value of what you're taking out of the country. So in our case, we had to quantify the value of a set that we would be taking to Malta. We valued it, obviously there's a temptation, and I discussed this with the haulage guy, to value it quite low. But obviously Customs and Excise are looking out for people doing that very thing. So you have to kind of navigate your way through what is a reasonable valuation that you can justify if you're challenged. For us, we valued our set at £24,000. 30% of that, so in our case, £8,000, we would have had to put down as a guarantee, a kind of deposit, and guarantee that that would come back into the UK. So immediately what that poses is a cash flow problem that potentially you're looking at incurring every time you leave the UK and every time you return. Of course, when you return, they don't give you back the full 8,000 in our case. They take an admin charge. Surprise, surprise. It does appear, and I didn't fully get to the bottom of this, but it does appear with a bit of digging via the Chamber of Commerce that you can pay a one-off fee that is you don't get returned and that covers you for that carnet for a year for as many journeys as you might do. So obviously what you have to weigh up is cash flow, value, what you think you can afford. But there's a cost and a huge amount of people time needed in order to create your carnet in the first place. So you've got your carnet, you're leaving the UK. At the moment we all tend to trundle down to Dover, get on a boat or get on the Eurotunnel. Now this is where I'm a bit vague, but I understand, I just can't name the places because there's just too much information. But basically, you've got your carnet, but Dover don't process carnets. Your carnet has to be processed before you can leave the country. So what they've set up is 3 points in Kent I think it's an old airfield, some car park in the middle of nowhere and some other place, but there's 3 of them, which are your carnet processing places. So we were advised that we should allow 2 days waiting to have our carnet processed at some place, somewhere in rural Kent. Once we were then processed there, we would be given permission to head to Dover. I'm sure you've all even seen in the last couple of days the sort of scandal of how much money was spent on putting cones down the motorway heading to Dover, because the motorway will become a lorry park, we were advised. You have to allow another 2 days to wait at Dover in order to get on a ferry, in order to leave the country. So anyone who's ever freighted, ever before, and even if you haven't, if you consider paying a driver and the vehicle, you've already got 4 days to build in before you even leave the UK. Surprise, surprise, when you come back, it's exactly the same thing. Because Dover don't process carnets, you probably wait in Calais to get back into Dover. Then you get sent to your returning carnet point, which is a different 3 places, somewhere else in rural Kent. So pretty nasty, terrifying, terrible, costly stuff. And it really is. It's bleak and horrible. So let's assume you've managed all that. You've got your set safely off. It's made it into the EU and you're travelling on, in our case, to Malta. The next thing then is the people, because, of course, one of the people that's going to go is your driver. Again, this is Louise's potted Brexit notes. I'm not an expert. But as has previously been mentioned, you can, assuming no deal, assuming third country, we can go into the EU for 90 days out of 180, into the Schengen area, sorry, for 90 days out of 180 days. They don't have to be consecutive, but in any 6-month period, 90 days. Now, that's 90 days total. So if, for instance, you fly in, your arrival day, your time touring, and your flight back out day all count. However, that basic allowance, if we crash out with a no deal, doesn't allow you to work. It allows you to visit, it allows you to travel through, and it allows you to have meetings, but doesn't allow you to actually earn any money. If you're going to go into the EU and earn money, you have to either get a work permit or visa, or you have to go through the process of each country to work out what their work permit exemptions are. Now, for most performing arts, you do fall into, within the EU 27, you fall into the various exemptions that they have. But of course, nothing is ever straightforward. Every country has a different system of workplace exemption. So, for example, in France, you can get an exemption. It currently says as an actor, but I'd like to assume that could be flexed to include any performer. But you can get an exemption that allows you to be in France for up to 90 days. So you've got your 90 days in the Schengen, you've got your 90 days. You're keeping count somewhere on some horrific Excel spreadsheet. In Germany, you are allowed also to have 90 days. And that can be across a calendar year. So in France, you can stay for less than 90 days. In Germany, you can have 90 days allowance across a year. So you're now juggling this. If you were to go to the Netherlands, you can have one single visit of up to 6 weeks in a 13-week period. So already, if you're somebody like Motionhouse who's touring across the EU, my head is exploding. Another example, Spain. Apparently there's an exemption for performers to go in for less than 5 consecutive days or 20 non-consecutive days in 6 months. That's just 4 examples. Now, on top of that, again, assuming a hard Brexit, you've still got your 90 days in the Schengen area. Now, a lot of Brits go on holiday into the Schengen area. So I suddenly see a scenario where I have to say to my performers, you can't go on holiday and use up any of our Schengen days because your Schengen days are per individual. So you can see how the whole thing just starts to snowball in an absolutely horrific manner. So basically, that's all the horror story stuff. For us with Malta, I had to very quickly learn all of this. We found ourselves in the position where, as I said, we were performing in the middle of November. It actually only officially takes 4 to 5 days to get to Malta with freight, by road and by sea. But in fact, what we realised we had to do, because we also had to tie in with various sort of Malta problems and their kind of worries about whether our set would get there, they told us that they wanted our set to leave before Brexit Day. So we then found ourselves in a position, okay, we've got to leave the country before we need a carnet. This is assuming, of course, at this point we thought Brexit was going to be happening. So we would have to leave the UK without needing a carnet, but we would have to have a carnet to come back in afterwards because we would no longer be in the EU. So the advice I got for that was, well, you have to have a carnet before you leave, because otherwise you're not going to have any proof that what you took out, and therefore the whole point of a carnet, you can't demonstrate that you've taken out the stuff you brought in. However, when we then approached the Chamber of Commerce, which is where you get your carnets, they told us that they couldn't issue us with a carnet before the 1st of November because we were still in the EU. So whilst that's a bit of a ridiculous story, and thank God we didn't crash out, it's something that's worth knowing, that the whole administrative setup, even though there was all these millions being spent on preparation for Brexit, simple fundamentals were not in place and would not have been in place for us to go to Malta. I could not get any response through a number of avenues about what the work permit or otherwise situation would be for the performers performing in Malta. But so it's a massive can of worms, and what I feel is at least I learned a huge amount in a very short time, and whatever happens next, I'm going to feel a little bit more ready, but there is absolutely no doubt about it. We're all going to have to do a hell of a lot more work than we currently do. It's going to have massive, massive impact on capacity. It's going to have big financial impact, and it's going to be just monstrous. So sorry that it's not a good news story, but there we go. Thank you.
Wowza, wowza, wowza. Wow. Extraordinary. The haulage guy, who was so brilliant, other things like he said, oh, by the way, when you're in rural Kent, don't expect to be prioritised as a theatre company or a dance company, because obviously perishable goods will go way before you and medical supplies. So you'll just be there for even longer if you're doing something as cultural. Just forget that. And yeah, it's terrifying. It's terrifying, and the lack of readiness makes me very, very angry. Hey, thank you both so much. The worst gig of the thing. Annika and Louise, thank you. Brilliant. I'm so grateful. Really, really kind of you. Thank you very much. That's great. You're wonderful, and we'll all be returning to you, Louise. Amazing. Yeah, when we went to Tariga and we did this little meeting, and I have to say what was wonderful was how supportive our European colleagues were.